I'm joined now by Daniel L. Davis, a senior fellow for defense priorities and a former lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army. He's been deployed into combat zones 4 different times. He's also the author of 11th Hour in 2020 America, How America's Foreign Policy Got Jacked Up, and How the Next Administration Can Fix It. He served for almost 21 years of active service, and he also was in Operation Desert Storm, Iraq, Afghanistan twice. He was awarded the Bronze Star Medal for Valor at the Battle of 73 Easting, and also a Bronze Star Medal in Afghanistan in 2011. He joins us now and tweets at Daniel L. Davis 1. Welcome back to the show, Lieutenant Colonel Davis. How are you?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me back. Always love to be on your show.
You know, there's a lot going on from Ukraine to now what's happening with the president's tour and comments on Taiwan. Let's start at the latter if we can, because him talking about the idea of being quite clear and saying, yes, they'd agree to something, this whole strategy of ambiguity seems to have gone out the window. Do you see it that way as being problematic?
Absolutely. I see it as being problematic. I mean, first of all, just fundamentally, the president of the United States, no matter who it is, does not have the authority to take us to war against China. You can't unilaterally just say, all right, we're going to be strategically clear now. We're going to defend Taiwan if you attack. You don't have a treaty for that. And the United States Congress exclusively has the power to declare war. So if we're going to have a Article 5 type obligation for Taiwan, the Congress has to approve that first. And right now, there's not even any talk about doing that. Now, of course, I would argue that that'd be a dramatic mistake because our national security interests are not tied up with what happens with China and Taiwan, however much we may hate it. And there's things we can do about it. We can talk about that. But unless our security is directly threatened, we dare not go to war, especially with a nuclear-armed China.
So what should the strategy be? I mean, obviously, there's almost a bit of this strategy of ambiguity has been to have this robust but unofficial relationship with Taiwan. But we do supply weapons and the like. So we have, I mean, is it the idea of a wink and a nod and that just by saying it out loud, that's problematic? Because surely China must know.
Well, certainly China knows that we have the strategic ambiguity. They're actually okay with that. They know about the Taiwan Relations Act, where we signed up to help Taiwan defend themselves, and that's the key there. Taiwan defend themselves, not that we will defend them. But look, there's something that doesn't get talked about very much. Before anybody goes and signing up United States people, American troops to potentially go and die in a war, we need to make sure that Taiwan is doing their share first. And look, the fact is, last year they spent 1.7% on their national defense. So they have to step up way to the plate and do more on their own defense. And only 60% of some of their frontline combat units are filled because the people don't recognize or don't believe that there's that much of a threat, and they don't feel the need to defend their country. Now, why should America put our troops on the line and our money on the line when they're not even doing it on their own line? And I think that until that changes, I think we need to cool any talk about providing security for them.
And yet you've heard, I mean, not just the walking back, but the decision not to be committal when you're talking about General Mark Milley or Lloyd Austin on these very issues. For that, I think the idea of the boots on the ground. But it's of course, an interesting conversation and one that he's not revelatory. He said it 3 times now, at least, about the idea of being supportive in some form or fashion. But here we are in the backdrop of Ukraine, which is probably what makes it change and be all the more impactful, although he has said it before. So what is the distinction for you in terms of the way in which Biden has spoken about even almost paralleling the defense we'd have for our NATO allies with Taiwan, and yet we know with Ukraine, it's not such the idea of you have to help yourself first. Is it just the urgency and the realization of the presence of the invasion that changes things?
Well, I don't know if that changes anything. If anything, it should illuminate, just what kind of risk that we would be taking if we engage in that. I mean, can you imagine with all the support and the money that we've committed to Ukraine, if we then suddenly found ourselves in a similar situation with Taiwan to where we might be actually called upon to engage against China, I mean, that would wreck our country. I mean, we could not possibly take on both Russia and China at the same time, really in any capacity. And I think that should be a much sobering realization to any of these policymakers before we go about rattling too many sabers. I mean, we need to take care of our country and not overextend to where we might not be able to help either or even risk our own national security.
So where we stand right now with Ukraine, I mean, there is obviously, we know from the Ukrainian negotiator that there will be, although there was some talk of it before, there'll be no ceasefire or concessions made to Russia. What do you know about this latest decision?
Yeah, that I mean, I understand the mentality there. I mean, who would want to make any kind of a negotiation that's going to cede some of your country to a hostile power? But, I mean, at some point, they may have to come face-to-face with the potential of saying, hey, we're going to hold out for all of our territory back and then potentially lose more. Because, look, we're giving them, we've now committed, I think, $54 billion total, and we're supplying now lots of howitzers, ammunition, and a bunch of other support. But so far, especially in the key area, the northern shoulder of the Donbas fight, Russia continues to make methodical progress there. And if they turn that key then in the north, they can literally roll up the whole of the Donbas in front of there, despite all the things that we're giving them. So if you say, I'm not going to negotiate until we get everything, then you may actually be working against your own interest, because right now they could probably make a deal that would keep the rest of their country. But if they go too far and hold that top line, or I'm just saying no one wants it to be that way, but at some point you have to face the mad battlefield realities if Russia takes the Donbas. That could change the calculation.
Well, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin spoke about this notion of, the idea it's Ukraine's fight and they get to decide. Here he is. A Secretary of Defense talking about it's Ukraine's fight, not our fight. Here we go.
Well, what we will abide by is what our president decides that we will do going forward. That will be a policy decision. But again, I think this is Ukraine's fight. It's not the United States' fight. We are doing everything that we can to make sure that we are supporting them in their effort to defend their sovereign territory. The rest of the international community is doing the same, Tom. And again, since it's their fight, it's their country, I want to make sure that they have the say-so in terms of, what end state looks like.
And yet, of course, as General Mark Milley had to address Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin also said that they are committed to Ukraine for the long term. Here he is.
The United States is committed to standing with Ukraine over the long term, and that's why President Biden recently signed a $40 billion funding bill to help Ukraine. The additional defense resources in the bill will help us to send Ukraine even more artillery and armored vehicles and ammunition. Since the start of President Biden's administration, we have committed some $4.6 billion in security assistance to Ukraine, including some $3.9 billion since Russia's unjust invasion began. And President Biden announced last Thursday that he has authorized another presidential drawdown of security assistance for Ukraine, valued up to an additional $100 million. And that will help ensure that U.S. assistance to Ukraine continues to flow without interruption. This latest package will help Ukraine meet critical needs for today's fight, including 18 more howitzers, 18 tactical vehicles to tow them, counter-artillery radars, field equipment, and urgently needed spare parts. So the United States will continue to do our part, and I'd welcome the opportunity to hear from you today on your current contributions of security assistance and pledges to do even more. And ladies and gentlemen, we have a lot to do together. And that's just how we'll move forward, together.
Now, Lieutenant Colonel, when they're talking about the long term, to your point, the long term and self-determination, and it's their fight and you're able to do what you want to do, those are all true statements, yet the United States is financing a lot of what's happening, as are other nations, of course. Does that factor into the idea of the U.S. being able to be committed long term, having it say it's Ukraine's fight, and yet there's a huge reliance on American dollars to be able to sustain that?
Well, there is, without question, and certainly I totally buy into the concept that the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian leadership get to make the call about what they're going to try to do, because I'm not in their position, so I couldn't possibly, say what they should do. What I can do, though, is say that based on a unemotional military analysis, is that even with all of this stuff, even with these 18 additional howitzers, I think that brings up the total to nearly 100 cannons. And while that sounds like a good number, when you compare it to the thousands that the Russians have on their hand, you understand that that's not going to be decisive. That's not going to change the battle any. And in fact, some of the howitzers we've sent down have already been destroyed, according to some reports. So they don't have any special ability to not be hit the way any of the others are in this huge artillery fight down there. And so, yes, Ukraine gets to make that call, but at some point we have to say, do we want to continue to provide, unlimited, basically, help in financing something that we can see is not going to be working? Because at some point we have to say, okay, you're going to lose the territory, and so you're going to have to be fighting even further back, and it might not help. And I don't know where or even if this line gets crossed without having somebody in the United States say, okay, we're not going to help, because I can certainly see that would be pretty hard. But Ukraine leadership is going to have to face that decision if they don't win in the Donbas.
So, in terms of the military strategy, what is Ukraine to do? In the sense of, there's the idea of, it sounds like you're saying the writing is on the wall that some concession will have to be made, some territory ceded. But obviously there's no support, I'm sure, publicly for this very notion. And yet I wonder how you gauge the military strategy and where you go, given that, much of the world has been amazed. I think that's not even an overstatement, by the ability of Ukraine's military to resist and repel the invasion by what people thought was an extraordinarily strong military force that is Russia, and it turns out it is not, strategically or otherwise. So, what would be the advice given?
Yeah, without question, Russia is not anywhere near as good as what really they should have been, based on the capacity they've had, and in terms of the weapons and the armor that they have, and the time they've had to train. But we have to be careful to understand that while they're not as good as we thought, they are still very capable, and they're demonstrating it in the Donbas area, that they have the ability to learn from their mistakes and then continue to make progress. If you see the calculation overall, as my assessment does, that you don't have the capacity to continue to resist long term, because we're seeing, I don't know if you saw this or not, but in earlier news from Ukraine I saw today that Zelensky, on some of the Ukraine media, admitted that they were losing up to 100 soldiers per day in the Donbas fight by itself. And look, you just can't sustain that over time, no matter how many howitzers the United States sends. If you're getting what few of the trained soldiers you have killed at that rate, you just can't replace those troops with new recruits or whatever. It doesn't work that way. And so that's why I keep going back over and over that at some point you're going to have to acknowledge combat reality and not risk losing any more of your country than you already have.
So, and if that were to happen, if that territory was ceded, do you think that would ultimately stop the invasion, and that Vladimir Putin would say, okay, we've won in some respect, we've gotten what we've came here for? It sounds like the goal is total annihilation of the country.
No, that was never the goal. I know a lot of people are saying that, but you can see that, number one, by the number of troops that Russia allocated for this from the beginning. There was not even a fraction of as many troops as you would have to actually destroy a country. They allocated enough troops to capture the Donbas. They thought they could get by cheap and get Ukraine. They realized what a disastrous miscalculation that was. But now then they've taken Kherson. They've taken now Mariupol. That's completely there. So now then you see they're solidifying their hold in the south. And if they take the Donbas, then again Odessa comes back into the equation, and Russia could completely close off the Black Sea coast as well as the Azov coast in there, and that would put a huge crimp on Ukraine's ability to continue to function as a nation in their economy, and would put Russia in a much better position to have this be a buffer that they would then have had if they take the Donbas in there from really all the way from Belarus all the way down through the Black Coast to Moldova. If Russia gets that, I think it would absolutely be in Russia's case to say they were willing to negotiate an end, because they were willing to on March 29th when they had that meeting in Istanbul with the Ukrainian side. They were willing to negotiate an end then. So there's no reason to think they wouldn't be able to do it now, because they don't have the capacity to completely destroy the country. They just don't have it.
So you really think that they were willing, that diplomacy was a possibility before the invasion?
It was, for sure. 100% it was. It was before the war. Look, they had the Minsk agreements that Russia was trying to get that wouldn't have even been a war. Then Putin came out with another even higher demand in December. And just before the war started in February, there was a comment by one of the Ukrainian ambassadors that said, well, maybe we just declare that we're not going to join NATO and maybe we won't even go any further. And Moscow immediately jumped on that and said, yes, that would solve the problem. So they've been very consistent from the beginning to say that Ukraine and NATO is an existential threat with which they're using to use force. Now they have. And so they still say, look, if you can declare, which they did in November in Istanbul, if you'll declare neutrality and that you're not going to join NATO, then we can reach an end and end this fighting. They're still saying that because, and look, you also have to recognize that Putin has been badly gouged by this militarily, and it'll take them a decade just to recover from where they started on this. So he has an incentive to get this done as well. It's not a one-way deal.
But what about the idea? I mean, just it seems like you give a lot of credit in the sense that you believe this needs to be rational actors, and I don't know the sense of which that is true, but I also wonder in terms of the propaganda machine that we know is obvious in Russia. Do you think it's pragmatic that Putin could especially spin this, or practical that he could spin it to say, look, we've come here. This is what you're saying is so different than what he has told the Russian people about why he's there. How would that be received, you think, by his people?
Oh, no, I think it's completely consistent with what he's been saying and continues to say, which is that they want to disarm what they call the Nazis and to demilitarize that area, which now with the loss of the Azov battalion in Mariupol, they could easily claim that, because that's what they said was the Nazi element, was the Azov battalion primarily. And that that he wanted the Ukrainians to admit or to declare they would not join NATO. He gets those two things, and then the other territorial aspect is the Donbas. If he gets those three things, that's what he said from the beginning. So that would be pretty easy for him to spin into a victory narrative for his people, because they continue to say that even to this day.
Given the loss of life that we're seeing and just the destruction of so many areas physically, of course, for the humanitarian issues as well, I just really wonder what the outcome will be. And I'm sure the people of Ukraine and, frankly, people of Russia likely are asking the same questions, and the American public and everyone else who is looking abroad to see how this will all pan out. Thank you for your insight. I appreciate hearing from you. Thank you so much.
Always my pleasure, Laura. Thanks for having me.